The morning was supposed to be peaceful. I'd woken at 6:30, made my coffee, and grabbed my fishing rod. Mist lifted off the lake behind my house, the water glass still begging to be cast into. For me, early mornings at the lake weren't just about catching bass. They were reminders of childhood, of my father waking me before sunrise and taking me to Miller's Pond with crusty old tackle boxes that smelled like rust and hope. Now, as the owner of a local bait and tackle shop, dawn fishing was equal parts tradition and business. It let me test new lures and know exactly what I'd recommend to customers later that day. But all those calm, familiar associations evaporated the moment I saw her. Heather Collins was standing in my driveway like a sentry at a palace gate, red blazer so stiff it looked like battle armor. A scratched badge, shiny enough to catch the sunlight but worn enough to betray its age, was pinned proudly to her chest. A clipboard was clutched against her like it contained nuclear launch codes. She had positioned herself with purpose, blocking the way to my own lake as though she had been stationed there by legitimate authority instead of just deciding she belonged. "Excuse me, sir," she began in that nasal, too-loud tone that pretends politeness while dripping with condescension. "I'm Heather Collins, president of the Lakeside Homeowners Association. I need to inform you that this is private property." She said it with finality, as if speaking the words made them real. I stopped in my tracks, half expecting a hidden camera crew to jump out, because surely this had to be comedy. "Private property?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yes," she replied quickly, tapping her clipboard. "According to Section 12A of the Lakeside Covenant, this parcel is designated community property. Unauthorized fishing violates the standards of our membership. There is a $50 daily usage fee for non-members." She handed out a yellow citation slip like I'd just parked illegally downtown. That's when I noticed the badge. I looked closer, and the faded print on the bottom revealed an expiration date, 2 years past. "This badge," I said slowly, pointing, "is expired." She yanked it back to her chest, flushed red, and scribbled something with aggression on her clipboard. I felt my heart pound with a mix of disbelief and simmering anger. This woman was in my driveway telling me I couldn't access my lake, with a credential worth less than a high school library card. I pulled out my phone and started recording. If she wanted to play official, then fine. Let her words live forever in HD clarity. "You are in violation," she announced with manufactured authority, "and continued use will result in escalating fines." Before I could respond, a locksmith truck pulled up, followed by a tow truck, the cavalry she had apparently called in. She told them my car was blocking HOA emergency access. The locksmith asked a single question. "Sir, is this your property?" I pointed to the survey markers, the iron stakes hammered into the dirt with county stamps. Both drivers nodded, packed up, and left, muttering to each other. Heather, humiliated, began shouting about liability and county codes, but her words evaporated into the morning air over the lake. Neighbors had emerged during the commotion. Sophie Clark, coffee mug warm between both hands, stood on her porch watching with a sympathetic expression. The silent shrug that said, "Sorry, welcome to our crazy." She'd always been kind, waving as she drove by, keeping her yard tidy but not obsessive. Seeing her look at Heather the way you watch an unhinged play unfold confirmed I wasn't imagining things. Then there was George Miller across the street, arms crossed, lips pinched in approval at everything Heather declared. George was the kind of man who ironed his lawn edges in triple-measured shrub symmetry. Her talk of rules and covenants was gospel to him. In the eyes of half the street, I was the violator. Heather's finale came with a flourish. "The neighborhood forum will hear of this," she declared, shoving her clipboard under her arm. "There will be a community meeting on Tuesday. Residents will vote on enforcement for repeat violators." She stormed into her spotless silver sedan, door slamming like a gavel. I stood frozen, fishing rod tangled in my hands, wondering what the hell had just happened on what was supposed to be a tranquil morning. In 10 minutes, I had been escalated from homeowner to outlaw in the eyes of a self-appointed HOA president I'd never met before. There were no bylaws in my mail, no welcome packets, no official correspondence in all the time I had lived here. Yet here she was, acting like mayor of a phantom town, waving expired credentials and issuing citations that crumbled upon scrutiny. It wasn't about rules. It wasn't about the environment. Standing there with cold coffee and a useless fishing line, one thought rooted itself deep in me. This wasn't about order. It was about control. And judging by the silence of neighbors and the way George nodded, Heather had been running this make-believe empire longer than I'd realized. I hit stop on my phone recording and tucked it in my pocket. If Heather wanted a battle over authority, I'd give her what she least expected: proof, paper, receipts. This skirmish at my driveway wasn't the end. It was the start. Something told me the story behind that expired badge ran deeper than citations or clipboard drama, and I had no intentions of being anyone's pawn in their fake little kingdom. The morning after Heather tried waving her expired badge in my face and left in a storm of irritation, I thought maybe it would blow over. Some people bark loud but let pride mask the silence that follows. Maybe she just needed to save face in front of George Miller and the others. Then the show would stop. But by 9 a.m., a bright yellow citation was taped to my front door. By noon, another one was stuck to my mailbox. By evening, there were 3, each stranger than the last. Unauthorized lake usage. Violation of community standards. Failure to submit wildlife management plan. Wildlife management? I ran a small tackle shop for weekend fishermen. I wasn't operating an oil refinery. The absurdity would have been laughable if it hadn't begun to feel like a choke collar tightening around my day-to-day existence. The notices didn't stop there. They escalated like a snowball tumbling downhill. By midweek, I had final warnings threatening $500 fines, pending enforcement actions, even bolded phrases about potential property seizure for habitual non-compliance. They all looked like legal documents until you looked twice. No county letterheads, no official signatures. Just Heather's looping script copied into a carbon copy template that looked like it had been pulled off Google and stamped with invented authority. But the problem wasn't their legitimacy. The problem was perception. Neighbors saw the papers piling up on my gate, and whispers started running faster than mosquitoes in July. Sophie still waved, but now her smile looked more like sympathy than camaraderie. George, of course, strutted around as though he'd watched justice delivered daily. Other neighbors just looked away. One even muttered, "Pay your fees," when I grabbed the mail, like I was a delinquent teenager instead of the deed-holding owner of the very lake Heather claimed as community space. The silence of the crowd began to feel more incriminating than Heather's noise. Then she took her campaign beyond my street. Calls began trickling into my tackle shop. A longtime customer looked uneasy as she leaned against the counter. "Daniel, some woman claiming to be HOA president called us. Said you're under some kind of investigation for, well, environmental violations. Toxic runoff." My mouth went dry. Toxic runoff? From my fishing rod? I forced a steady voice. "That's not true." But the damage was done. 3 customers left without buying a single hook that day. Each lost sale felt like Heather had driven a nail into my livelihood. She had found a new way to raise the stakes, make the cost of resisting her lie more expensive than just going along with it. The irony hit me late one night when I sat out by the lake in the kind of stillness too deep to ignore. This water had healed me. After Elaine, my wife, passed 3 years ago, the city became unbearable. Sirens weren't background noise anymore. They were torture. Every ambulance reminded me of the one that came too late. Professional grief counselors called it trigger sensitivity. I called it hell. Buying at the county auction hadn't been a financial decision. It had been a lifeline. The first morning I fished here, alone but not lonely, I felt my chest actually loosen for the first time in months. Casting a line into still water was the nearest thing to peace I'd had since she left. Now Heather Collins stood on my shoreline, daring to poison it with paperwork and performance. It cut deeper than the fake fine suggested. She wasn't just attacking property. She was trespassing against my sanctuary. But Heather had one more card to play, and this was where her strategy should have been brilliant, if I hadn't seen through it. She pivoted to environmental stewardship. On the neighborhood forum, she uploaded a slideshow like she was running PR for the Sierra Club. Photos of trash along the shoreline, supposedly from unauthorized fishing. Snapshots of disturbed vegetation she blamed on me. And the kicker. For the safety of our shared ecosystems, we cannot allow one individual's recreational indulgence to endanger our community's natural heritage. It sounded noble. It sounded righteous. And it sounded completely fake, because I'd spent the night analyzing the metadata of her photos. Their timestamps were months old. Their GPS tags pointed to the opposite side of the lake where she'd clearly wandered, snapping shots not even near my shore. I had counter photos, fresh images with timestamps and everything, proving her environmental damage wasn't mine. But still, the power of narrative was already spreading. George nodded more smugly than ever at the meeting posters she taped on light poles. Another neighbor asked if I really cared about birds nesting. The war was psychological now, not just procedural. Heather was twisting the one thing she knew could play well in polite suburbia: protect the environment. Because who wants to question the hero protecting ducks and sparrows? So I began documenting everything. Cameras went up on the property line, multiple angles with audio. Every conversation, phone call, anytime Heather so much as sneezed in my general direction, I had it recorded. Every night I filled folders on my laptop with pictures, dates, cross-referenced files, sharper proof than any emotional fury could ever provide. Because I finally understood what she was really doing. She wasn't enforcing rules. She was manufacturing authority. The longer I let it run without challenging the foundation, the higher her scaffolding of lies would climb. But even with evidence building on my side, I couldn't escape the feeling in my gut. Heather wasn't operating alone. She had George nodding always, neighbors deferring to her documentation, people whispering that's just how it's always been, like muscle memory. Either they were cowed into submission or complicit in the scam. Either way, something bigger was beneath this surface. Fake HOA, fake covenants, manufactured environmental crises. As the sun set over the glass-still lake, I reeled in one last cast and sat staring at the ripples fading into dark. Heather was playing power games, sure, but no one invests this much effort unless there are dollars involved. And with Sophie quietly admitting she paid access fees for 2 years, the outline of the scam revealed itself like a fish surfacing for air. Heather wasn't just feeding her ego, she was feeding her bank account. That night, as cicadas sang under the porch light, I made a decision. The fishing rod wasn't my weapon anymore. Documentation was. Proof was. My next move would not be cast into the water. It would be cast into the public light. The harassment had reached fever pitch when my phone buzzed one afternoon with a call from Mark Lewis, an old college buddy who now managed a respected real estate law practice downtown. His voice was steady but firm. "Daniel, I saw Heather's latest forum post about you trespassing. We need to talk. You didn't just buy lakefront access at that county auction, you bought the entire parcel." His words hit me like a hook setting deep into the line. "The entire parcel?" I asked, pacing the tackle shop floor as my gut clenched with a mix of shock and curiosity. Mark didn't hesitate. "Yes. The deed includes water rights, buffer zones, mineral rights. The whole lake belongs to you. Heather doesn't have authority over a square inch. She's bluffing, Daniel, and it's time you pulled the rug out from under her." That night I drove to the courthouse with the intensity of a fisherman chasing a record catch. Inside the property office, the clerk pulled a thick, untouched file from cold storage and spread it across the counter. Parcel number 478, my name on the deed. The description was clinical, but every line was dynamite. All that body of water known as Lakeside, with 50-foot buffer surrounding, including all mineral and recreational rights. My eyes scanned official stamps, survey maps with county seals, surveyor signatures so meticulous they cut through decades of Heather's clipboard theater like a knife through bait line. There it was. Proof that eliminated any shadow of doubt. I printed multiple certified copies. Holding them in my hands felt heavier than paper. It felt like armor. This wasn't about opinions anymore. This wasn't about neighbors shrugging. That's how it's always been. It was cold legal fact. Heather Collins couldn't call herself an HOA president because there was no HOA. There never had been, not legally. A quick incorporation search confirmed it. No filing, no bylaws, no election records. For years she had been running a performance piece, a fake civic theater where she played the star, issuing fake citations, pocketing environmental fees, and manufacturing authority over a resource that never belonged to her. The enormity of her scam began to sink in as I retraced conversations. Sophie paying $50 monthly for lake preservation. George bragging about our HOA keeping values strong. Receipts my cameras had captured. Trucks unloading landscaping materials late at night into Heather's backyard. Materials billed under lake habitat restoration. Suddenly, a pattern glistened on the surface as clearly as a school of fish under shallow water. The HOA was never real, but the money was. That weekend I spread everything across my kitchen table, the certified deed copies, County plat maps, photos, and a stack of USBs with surveillance camera footage. One file in particular made my jaw tighten. It showed a county logo truck unloading sodded grass rolls into Heather's lawn in the middle of the night. My camera's infrared caught her standing there directing workers. The timestamp matched a week she claimed emergency environmental restoration had been done around the lake. Restoration? More like a landscaping scam fronting her faux government racket. When I showed the footage to Sophie, her face drained of color. Daniel and I paid into that lake fund twice a year. We all assumed she was hiring conservation crews. I can't believe she stopped, hand over her mouth as if holding back nausea. She's been stealing from us. Her quiet confession echoed what my evidence already screamed. Heather wasn't just power-hungry. She was profiting, parasitically off neighbors too polite or too fearful to demand receipts. But Heather wasn't giving ground. Each time I posted questions on the forum, she countered with vague covenants and fuzzy environmental statutes, wrapped in word salad meant to scare those unwilling to comb through paperwork. George clapped along in comments, reinforcing the illusion. But documents beat rhetoric every time, and I had stacks of them. The turning point came at a so-called mediation Heather staged at George Miller's living room. About 20 neighbors sat nervously in folding chairs, cookies and coffee offered like bribes. Heather opened with a calm, therapist-tone speech about community harmony and misunderstandings, positioning herself as the adult in the room. Then I dropped my ace. Out came the certified deed copies with bright red county seals. I smoothed them deliberately across the coffee table for everyone to see. Here's the truth. I don't just own this house. I own the entire lake, all of it. The county records confirm it. Heather has never had the authority she claims. There is no legally incorporated HOA here. Everything you've been paying, every fine notice, every citation is fraudulent. The living room went stone silent. Sophie's eyes widened. 2 other residents leaned forward, scanning the seals. George's coffee cup rattled in his hand. Heather froze, expression locked like a fish snagged in shallow rocks. She sputtered quickly. Well, covenants supersede purchases, but the words fell flat. People weren't looking at her anymore. They were looking at me, or more specifically, the papers glowing with legitimacy under the lamplight. For punctuation, I played the surveillance footage on Sophie's phone, county logo trucks unloading into Heather's yard, her own scam on screen. The silence broke into outrage. Murmurs turned into shouted questions. Where did our money go? Why hasn't anyone seen bylaws? How long has this been happening? Heather's red blazer armor did nothing against collective suspicion. By the time I left George's house that night, my deed copies were folded back into their binder, but the truth had already been planted like stakes around the lake. Heather wasn't president of anything. She was queen of a fiction that had just run out of chapters, and the deeper neighbors dug, the more they'd see every nickel collected and every rule enforced had been part of a con. The fishing line of her con had finally snapped, and suddenly she wasn't reeling me in. I was reeling her whole operation to the surface. If part 3 had been about proof, then part 4 was about perception. Facts were on my side, the deed, the seals, the surveillance footage. But Heather wasn't fighting with facts. She was fighting with theater, and when her authority collapsed under the weight of county documents, she knew exactly what card to pull next. In suburbia, no weapon carries more weight than the phrase environmental protection. Because who dares stand against nature? Who wants to be the neighbor branded a destroyer of ecosystems? The pivot was swift. Overnight, orange barricades appeared along the edges of my lake like crime scene tape. By dawn, a mesh of neon hazard fencing zigzagged across the shoreline, flapping in the wind with bright warning signs. County Habitat Assessment Zone, no trespass. Parked near the barricades were white pickup trucks stenciled Wildlife Impact Team, engines idling while men in reflective vests photographed shrubs and tossed measuring tapes carelessly across the mud. To the casual eye, it looked official. Badges, clipboards, county citations taped to poles. But I knew enough to smell the setup. No legitimate authority files overnight restrictions on private land without notifying the owner. And I, the owner, hadn't received a thing. Standing at my fence that morning, I felt the tide had turned against me. Not in the law, but in the eyes of the neighbors. George Miller strutted around telling anyone within earshot that, finally, the county had stepped in to protect what belonged to the community. Sophie wouldn't meet my eye when I waved, as though even acknowledging me branded her complicit. And the cruelest sting came from the tackle shop. 2 of my longtime customers canceled custom lure orders, sheepishly explaining that, with the environmental probe, we can't be associated right now. Heather had found her angle, and it was working. The neighborhood forum exploded with her latest post. Dramatic images of trash pits, damaged vegetation, and illegal fire rings, all pinned neatly to the narrative of community stewardship. Her words dripped with faux compassion. As responsible stewards of our shared natural resource, we must prioritize ecological health over individual indulgence. Businesslike, neutral, even righteous. The language of a conservation brochure, not a power-hungry neighbor with a fraudulent badge. And yet the comments section told me people were buying it. When facts are complicated, people prefer performances. But performances can slip, and mine came in the form of cameras. My motion-activated night vision units caught the habitat trucks returning after dark to unload materials, not to a county disposal site, but directly into Heather's backyard. My footage caught it in damning clarity, bags of soil piled against her fence, decorative stones rolled into her patio garden, trays of lush plants disappearing into her flower beds. The very restoration supplies paid for by her phony lake fund were enriching her property under the glow of my infrared cameras. Still, facts didn't soothe the reality of isolation. Every step outside now felt like walking through suspicion. At the grocery store, someone hissed, "Pay your dues," under their breath as I passed. Calls to my shop dwindled as whispers of me being under investigation swirled like minnows scattering in shallow water. Even the mail carrier dropped letters with a guilty tilt of the head, as if my driveway carried contagion. Alone at dusk, sitting on my porch, I thought of Elaine again. Her laughter across lakes just like this one, her steady voice telling me not to give an inch on something important. But grief has a gravity, and combined with social exile, it weighed like anchors on my chest. That's when Sophie broke ranks. She slid into my booth at the local coffee shop one morning, her voice low, her eyes scanning for spies. "I have to show you something," she whispered, unlocking her phone. Her gallery was stacked with photos of receipts, payment schedules, and worst of all, screenshots of text messages between Heather and her contractor relatives. In them, Heather bragged about milking the environmental angle for all it's worth and keeping pressure up until he caves and pays. It wasn't conservation. It wasn't stewardship. It was extortion under a green mask. Sophie's face was pale. "Daniel, she's been doing this for 5 years. We've all been victims. You're just the first to stand up to her." My pulse steadied, not from relief but from confirmation. My instincts had been right all along. Heather hadn't just manufactured HOA power. She had erected a multi-layered con, fake authority wrapped in fake environmental activism, all funneling into her backyard. But even armed with Sophie's testimony, the fight was now about endurance. Could I survive the perception war long enough to let the truth become undeniable? Could facts outweigh symbols plastered on fences and whispered in checkout lines? I looked at the fluorescent barricades hugging my lake and saw not just fencing, but a fortress she had built to isolate me, to shame me, to squeeze me socially until compliance sounded easier than resistance. Late one evening, looking across the water shimmering under fading light, I realized I was standing at a crossroad. If Heather's environmental gambit held, she'd rewrite not just the lake's story but mine. She'd turn my sanctuary into a case study of environmental protection while siphoning the profits. Unless I acted decisively, legally, publicly, unmistakably, her fiction would become the community's memory. So I gathered my proof, organized Sophie's files, cataloged every frame of footage. Heather had declared war through theater. My counterstrike would come not in whispers or barricades, but in the public light of a formal county hearing, where paper seals and sworn statements would finally outweigh expired badges and laminated nonsense. The lake lay quiet that night, deceptive as glass. But just below the surface, I could feel the storm gathering. The next move wouldn't just shift neighbors, it would decide everything. The county hearing room smelled faintly of dust and old wood polish, the kind of place where arguments had carried weight for generations. Long fluorescent lights hummed above the rows of folding chairs. Only this time it wasn't about zoning disputes or tax abatements. Today the question was whether Heather Collins' HOA empire ever truly existed at all. I sat at one long table with my attorney, Mark Lewis, my evidence binders stacked tall like fortress walls. On the opposite side, Heather sat ramrod straight, flanked by an attorney of her own and two stone-faced men I recognized as her contractor relatives, the so-called environmental crew. But her crimson blazer, freshly pressed and spotless, could not cover the flush rising up her neck. For the first time, she looked less like a queen on her throne, and more like a defendant bracing for judgment. Commissioner Sarah Martinez, a sharp woman with 30 years of county service, rapped the gavel lightly. We have received multiple complaints regarding alleged HOA enforcement irregularities, unauthorized environmental actions, and misuse of community funds. Today we are here to review the facts. Her tone was professional but edged with steel. She nodded toward me. Mr. Harris, you may begin. I stood slowly, palms flat against the table to quiet the nerves sparking through my fingers. Then I placed the first stack of documents, the official deed stamped with the county seal, my name etched across ownership of the entire lake and buffer zone. The first fact is simple, I began, voice steady. This lake belongs to me, not in theory, not as shared access, but outright. Full ownership, full rights, purchased legally at last year's county auction. Gasps rose from the audience benches, neighbors craning their necks to glimpse the red seal of the property documents. Commissioner Martinez leaned forward, scanning the parcel description line by line. Confirmed, she said to the stenographer. Mr. Harris is the legal owner of the water body. Heather shifted uneasily, her attorney whispering furiously into her ear. But I wasn't done. From the second binder, I pulled printed receipts and photographs Sophie Clark had tracked, showing how Lake Environment Fund payments from neighbors were rerouted directly into contracts with Miller Landscaping, George Miller's brother-in-law, and how those restoration projects were in reality sprinkler systems and sod planted in Heather's own backyard. Then came the video, my surveillance file projected onto the county screen, showing county logo trucks unloading bags of soil and decorative stones into Heather's property at night. Murmurs swelled into audible outrage among the residents who packed the gallery. For years they'd believed they were funding environmental stewardship. Now they saw clearly where their dollars had gone. Heather's face drained to chalk. She fumbled, whispering to her lawyer, who finally rose with a weak objection about misunderstandings of community bylaw governance. The commissioner raised an eyebrow. Bylaws? Show us then. Where are the HOA incorporation papers? The election records? The annual filings required for a nonprofit organization collecting community fees? She waited. But Heather had nothing. No bylaws, no signatures, no legitimacy, only stammering about community consensus and informal governance structures. Words as hollow as the badge she'd worn 2 years past its expiration. I pressed forward. Not only did she impersonate an HOA president, she used fabricated environmental crises to intimidate residents into compliance. She filed for enforcement actions under false pretenses, mobilized contractors under county guise, and spread defamatory lies about me to damage my business. This wasn't just overreach. It was fraud. It was theft. And it was impersonation of authority never granted. My hand shook slightly on the podium, but not from fear, from adrenaline. The same rush that comes when a fish finally breaks the surface, thrashing against the inevitability of truth. Commissioner Martinez conferred briefly with her colleagues, their whispers cutting sharp lines through the tense room. Then she looked up, voice crisp. The findings are clear. Mrs. Collins, you were never the legal officer of any entity. No Lakeside Homeowners Association exists in county filings. Your actions constitute unauthorized collection of funds, misrepresentation of authority, and fraudulent use of public resources. You are hereby ordered to return all collected monies, totaling $22,000 with interest, pay state fines of $8,000, and cease all claims of authority immediately. Furthermore, you will complete 200 hours of community service under county supervision, specifically at the lake you attempted to control. The gasp that spread through the room was almost physical, a wave of release that loosened the walls themselves. Heather stuttered weakly, trying to salvage pride. My intentions were good. I only wanted... But the words collapsed in her throat. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, stripped of authority, exposed as the con artist she had worked so hard to disguise. In the weeks that followed, The rulings were enforced with visible bite. Neighbors watched as Heather, sweating in weekend work clothes, unscrewed her own HOA access restricted signs from posts she had installed. Cell phones recorded her hauling fake notices into the trash. Every bolt removed a public symbol of her collapse. Even George Miller, embarrassed and cornered, admitted quietly that he'd been deceived, though his family's landscaping company faced its own audit. Sophie stayed by my side, helping draft new, transparent guidelines for the lake. No fake fees, just fair, democratic stewardship overseen by residents themselves. The first Saturday potluck by the lake brought more laughter than our streets had heard in months. Children played by the shoreline. George hammered posts for legitimate safety buoys. Sophie poured coffee and passed around cakes. And I sat in my lawn chair, rod line in the water, lake glistening in evening light, this time not as a battleground, but as home. The lake hadn't just held my grief, it had also held my resolve. Protecting it had proved more than just defending property. It had restored trust, forged new bonds, and shredded false authority under the weight of truth. And as Heather trudged past one final Saturday, fulfilling her service by clearing weeds along a shoreline she'd once claimed as her empire, the irony wasn't lost on anyone. Her fake authority had ended where it should have begun, in real stewardship under real accountability, for a lake she never owned.